Hi, guys. Welcome to class 14 of environmental law. Today, we are going to be working on our natural resources laws. So, not one particular statute, there's a bunch, but the laws designed to protect and manage our natural resources in our country. And then next week, we're going to talk about climate change, which is, obviously a very hot topic. So I think I'm going to do this in 3 lectures just because it makes sense to me. And then you get a little break between listening to me. So a little quote: we try to leave the earth a better place than when you arrived, which I don't think we're being very successful at, but we can do our part every day to leave the world a little better. Okay, so what are our natural resource laws? Any environmental laws that concern our natural resources, like land, fish and wildlife, groundwater, drinking water, really, fish and wildlife, that's our animals. Um, and any resources that are really managed by or held in trust by the United States government or and local governments or even foreign governments. So we have conservation laws, we have international environment and natural resource laws like treaties. There we'll talk about a couple of treaties in this unit. Endangered species is big, the difference between, the different categories of public lands. So that's kind of all stuff that we're going to talk about in this class. Okay, so public land classification, you might, any driving vacation you've been on, you might see like natural resources area, national park, national forest, all that stuff. So this is land that is, technically somehow owned by the federal government in the public domain. And there's different classes of these public lands, and they are all managed by different federal agencies. And depending on what the classification is, the protection of the resources or the standard for how these resources can be used are different. Okay, so any general public land is managed by our Bureau of Land Management. So the national forests are managed by the U.S. Forest Service. National wildlife refuges are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which of course has an acronym, USFWS, and then the national parks are managed by the National Park Service. So the BLM and the Forest Service, they can manage their their lands in ways that we call for the best that would best meet the needs of the American public. So that can include things like logging, grazing. If you have a big herd of cattle, you can go across these public lands for grazing, mining, and then other things more environmentally focused like wildlife and wilderness preservation. So let's start with our Bureau of Land Management. So that was established back in 1946, but it goes back farther than that. When our manifest destiny uh, needs were starting to grow, lands, right after we achieved independence for the British, the U.S. started going westward, right? You probably have seen movies or learned in your history books or watched things on the Discovery Channel or History Channel about westward migration, right? These lands were federal lands, And if you were willing to move out west on your wagon train or on your railroad and settle the land, the federal government would give you that land. So back in 1812, the General Land Office was created to support this whole like land rush. Um, and then so that kind then the land got settled, so we didn't really need to encourage or give away land anymore. And these attitudes regarding these public lands changed over time. And Harry Truman merged the General Land Office with the Grazing Service to create this Bureau of Land Management. So let's see. Here's an example of things that the Bureau of Land Management actually manages. Okay, so this is the one in Alaska. Look at that. So you have this is like a great example of the multiple uses of these federal lands. So you have like your oil pipeline, right next to like moose grazing land. Kind of crazy that they are coexisting there. So look at this. This is just in Alaska. They have 70 million surface acres and 220 million, excuse me, subsurface areas where there's mining. So they have like a ton of land in Alaska. And then they have visitor and outdoor education areas. They have they oversee the pipeline. All sorts of stuff there. But I do think this is like, well, do we have, there's, they don't have anything here there's not a lot of BLM land, or maybe none in Illinois, because I don't see any. So let's try eastern states. What do we have in the eastern states? Okay, there's 10,000 surface acres. So this is east. Well, this would be us, I guess, east of the Mississippi River. So this, doesn't it look like Michigan or something like that? So they have stuff in Minnesota, Appalachia, Maryland, Wisconsin rivers, Minnesota rivers. So anywho, they've got a lot of stuff. That's just like an example. And how they manage what they do. So again, BLM lands that are given to the Bureau of Land Management are for multiple uses. Okay. They prepare their land use plan. So they lease out land for mining, for logging. They also lease out land or allow land for recreational purposes. And then there are also lands that are designated as wilderness areas, which we'll get into a little later in the lecture. So that's what the Bureau of Land Management does. Okay, so yeah. So the BLM and the Forest Service, they manage land for multiple uses. But there are some tracts of land that are designated as what we call national wildlife refuges. And they can be part of these general federal lands or forest lands. But as a subset of that, they're like, okay, this one area is designated as a national wildlife refuge. Okay. And then the only thing that you can do there is conserve wildlife. So you can't have like snowmobiling trails or, logging or mining, or maybe whitewater rafting companies coming in. So we can only, the dominant use of the land has to be the conservation of wildlife. Probably there's camping, but with leave no trace rules or hiking or something like that. So national parks, versus national forests. So national parks are like the parks that we go to. We can go hiking, we can go camping, we can look at it. It's really pretty. um, they are both public lands, but um, the national parks are managed by the National Park Service. The national forests are managed by the U.S. Forest Service. Um, the mandate for national forests, the lands are managed for things like timber, recreation, grazing, wildlife, fishing, whatever else. So national forests are just public lands owned by the federal government, and they can be leased out for all sorts of different kinds of things. So they're right. What do they have to do? Productivity is an important word here. Sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. So, if you want to take your herd of cattle through there, you could probably do that with a permit. You can, maybe get a logging permit. You can maybe mine or put a pipeline on it or something like that. So the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people in the long run. So the national parks, they're different. That's just to preserve these lands for really like recreation, enjoyment, and somehow, preserving some of it for future generations. So what was an example up here? Like Yellowstone, is it Yellowstone? Boom, boom, boom was the first national park. So we kind of have a general idea of what Yellowstone is, right? We go, you can drive through, you can see all sorts of wildlife. They have cabins for rent. You can go hiking, um, all that fun stuff. And then national forests, like I go to Vermont quite a bit, and then you're just driving on a road, and you're like, oh, we're in the a national forest. So you might not even know that you're in a national forest because there'll be roads, there'll be all sorts of maybe houses or developments or businesses or something like that in and amongst these national forests. Okay, so back to here. Um, Yeah, so here's our, national park. The Yellowstone's a national park. Grand Canyon. So we understand state parks, a national park, bigger, right? Bigger and federally managed. National forest. Here's our Shawnee National Forest website. Oh, isn't that pretty? So all these things that you could do. This is down in Illinois. There's recreations, recreation stuff. So you could go camping, you can go look, paddleboarding, horseback riding, hiking. And there's also options to do things like log, mine, all that kind of stuff. So this is the one in Illinois down and in a bit, I'm going to talk about when I went down there, which was kind of fun. One of my COVID trips. Okay, so our our national forests again managed by the Forestry Service, and they can have leases for recreation or use of the resources. But national parks have more restrictions on the management, so they have to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects. And yeah, we're going to leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Okay, you have to preserve the natural condition, the primeval character and influence, right? You're not going to put graffiti or put a mural on the Grand Canyon or something like that, right? We're going to keep it as wildlife. Okay, so but general public lands and Forest Service, we can, mine, public lands, there's leasing minerals, all this examples of things that you can use the public lands for. Okay, so then there's this subsection of federal lands called wilderness refuges. Okay, so 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Wilderness Act. Okay, and it created this National Wilderness Preservation System. Okay, so anything that we already had in our federal lands that were classified as wilderness, I don't know what wilder canoe I meant to say there. Um, wilderness stuff was included in the system. Okay, but then there might be additional ones that were added to the system later because of just the pristine nature and the wilderness aspects of it. Okay, so now we have over 100 million acres in the wilderness system. And then it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to have been a forest or a park before it can, so depending on who owns the larger tract of or manages the larger tract of land, like the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, or the Park Service, um, the there still can be like a wilderness refuge in that area. So that was what I was. Okay, so these are anything that, to be classified as a wilderness area has to be just basically kind of like pristine, right? You don't want to have things that have been overrun by man or mankind's imprint. Okay, so an opportunity for some sort of recreation, right? Camping, primitive, unconfined recreation. There's a minimum size of 5,000 acres, or what they would say a sufficient size to make this preservation practicable. And then there may be features of like scenic, historic value, educational, things like that. So Illinois has one, where's the one that I went to? The Garden of the Gods Wilderness in the Shawnee National Forest. So way down, way down in southern Illinois, almost to Kentucky. So when I was during COVID, just really was cabin fever, as long as a bunch of you I know were. But so in fall of 2020, my husband wanted to go on a trip, and I didn't want to go to a big city or anywhere where there were people. So because I had been teaching this course, I was like, let's go down to the National Wilderness area in the Shawnee National Forest and do some hiking so we can, be alone and be outside and enjoy this. So we went down to this Garden of the Gods Wilderness. Maybe I'll post if I in the modules some pictures of us there. But it was very pristine. There were hiking trails, but other than that, like, you didn't have porta potties or you know concessions or things like that. You had to kind of pack. It was for hiking. You probably could camp there, but it would be leave no trace camping that you would have to like bring everything in and bring everything out. But it was like actually absolutely beautiful, and a little bit of a hassle down in I don't really want to see the ad to get there, but really cool. I saw this Camel Rock, right? So it looks like a camel. There's a camel's head and there's a couple of humps, um, and not really even like a very hard hike, but it was just really far away. It was like 6 or 7 hours to get there. So anyway, but I would recommend it for you. It's not really a day trip. You kind of have to stay over, but to be in our state and go to one of these wilderness areas, I would really recommend that everybody take the trip down there. We went in the fall, which was a lovely time to go. Now is probably a lovely time to go before it gets hot. So Anytime one of these federal lands is categorized, same thing, as a wilderness area, um, you're very, very limited on what this land can be used for, right? So we can't have roads in there. Um, an example, there was a wildfire in Colorado, and they didn't allow helicopters in to fight that fire. They were just like, okay, this is a wilderness area. This is what the wilderness does. This is what nature does. There's wildfires. We need to let it run its course. And then, presumably, if it was spilling out into places where it would harm people, they would then fight the fire. Boats and aircraft are only allowed in these wilderness areas if they were there before it was classified as a wilderness. So you can't like add that. Prospecting. This is the prospector from Toy Story, as you know. You can only allow it if it's compatible with the wilderness area. They give out permits for hikers and campers, but they limit the number of permits, by month or by season. There are rules of leave no trace, right? So you have to, everything you come in with, you have to come out with. They sometimes they might use the water source as a municipal water source. And look at this, 765 areas. What is that? 110 million acres, 44 states and Puerto Rico. And again, we are lucky that our state has a wilderness area. So I would really recommend going there at some point and hiking around and looking around and having all kinds of fun. I mean, that's one of I'm not like a real outdoorsy person, but I do like to walk outside and see pretty things. Okay, so those are our categories of federal lands, right? We have our general ones, our national forests, our national parks, our national wilderness areas, and all kind of managed by different agencies, and there's different goals for the use and restrictions on that land. Okay. So now we're going to talk about our wildlife resource protection laws. And then the first one we're going to talk about are our Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So I remember when my daughter was taking driver's ed and she was talking about the one bird you had to be careful of and you could never hit with your car is the Canadian geese, right? And they're all over the place. I don't know why they would be protected, but they are a migratory bird. Therefore, they are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. Look how far back went. So like back in the day, they used to like import birds or import like feathers from different countries because they were exotic. And then like the ladies' hats, they like these fancy feathers, or they take their nest, or they'd like move the birds to different locations as pets and things like that. So that seemed to be a big problem back in 1918, and a couple of countries got together to create or to agree to this Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Okay, so first it was just the United States and Great Britain who had this treaty. Now Mexico is part of it, Russia, Japan. And under this statute, which derives from the treaty, it is unlawful without some sort of waiver or permit to either pursue, right, chase, hunt, take, capture, kill, or sell birds. So any migratory birds that are listed under the act. Okay, so if you are a birder, one of the places I go to walk, there's people with cameras and binoculars all the time looking at the birds. They have really pretty, waterfowl in the little lake where I walk around. So that's fine. But if I'm like chasing it or taking their eggs or something along those lines, you can't do that under this. Okay. You can't, even if the bird's dead, you still can't sell it. You can't sell a stuffed bird or take their feathers. So yeah, all parts of the bird. You have your feathers, eggs, and your nests, and there are about 800 species on the list. Um, and if you, for some reason, need to pursue, hunt, take, capture, or kill one of these birds, you can get a permit by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service um, for falconry, or I guess breeding. That's propagation, right? Taxidermy, maybe if you're a museum or something, or you somehow have found a dead bird and you want to stuff it. Um, but usually for scientific and educational use only. So sometimes, oh, here's an example: bunch of geese near an airport. They might somehow divert them, scare them away, or kill them because geese can cause planes to crash. And so think about, like, this is 1918. There weren't any really environmental acts back in 1918, but it was seemed to be a problem because there was this big trading in birds and feathers. Um, so it was challenged in court in Missouri versus Holland in 1920, and it was upheld, and they said under the treaty making power, um, it was constitutional. This Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So here's, like, I have hummingbird feeders. I love my hummingbirds, and they come, they migrate big time. So they are like up by us. They go all the way down to like Mexico, or like southern Mexico, every year, these tiny itty bitty birds. So they are protected. These are some, I don't know what these are, some geese or something like that. So under the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 50, Chapter 1, it's section 1013. It's like called the 1013 list, are the lists of all of these birds that are protected. See here, all the members of the treaty: Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Russia. Some of them, we don't know what they are. But so, like, say I'm looking for hummingbirds. So I do Humming. Okay, so there's like a hummingbird, this subspecies of hummingbirds. Look at all of these hummingbirds. Okay, let's try goose. 14, the bean goose. I don't know. I don't know which. I know the barnacle goose, snow goose, Ross goose, a lot of geese too. Hawaiian goose, some swans. Hate swans. Some ducks, some doves, some nighthawks, a couple of whippoorwills. So there's a bunch. There's a bunch of birds on this list. So you can't shoot them, can't eat them, can't chase them. So in 2004, this treaty was amended. With the Migratory Bird Treaty Reform Act, right here, TRA. So this only applies to migratory bird species that are native to the United States. So if there's something that, like, somebody brought in a bunch of them and now they're migratory birds, which really turns into like a pest sometimes. Um, so so any bird that is present as a result of a natural occurrence, rather than human introduced bird species. So some of them there are birds that are not protected. Some ducks, another goose, the domestic, some geese, black swan, flamingos, Chilean flamingos. So because they were brought in, some pigeons, um, I guess I don't magpie, raven, different kinds of ravens. So I get a robin, Japanese robin, European robin, right? They're not our regular old robins that we have here. The European goldfinch, island canary, some kinds of cardinals too. So anywho, be careful about killing birds or scaring birds away because you might be held liable under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And or there might be an exception, but if you could tell the difference between the birds, more power to you. You know more than me. Yes, these horrible Canadian geese are protected. So, but you can get permits to manage them. So, like I know, say a golf course has a dog. So there's things that you can go do. So you can't destroy the nests. One of the things that I used to have a house on a lake, and they would call it was like egg addling, I think. So they would put oil on the eggs so that the eggs never matured. And I guess if you just took the eggs, then the geese would lay more eggs. So that was not the way to do it, or destroy the nest. Then they just create another nest and lay more eggs. So if you put this oil, the egg would never hatch and the birds wouldn't lay more eggs because they thought they had viable eggs there. So um, there are specific rules for Canada geese. They are protected, but there are specific rules, and you can do some things about them. I remember when I was a kid how rare they were, and they're not so rare anymore. All right, I'm going to stop this one video and start up again, talking about the Endangered Species Act. See you in a bit.